All right, we got to clear up a little bit. The last paragraph, 1 Samuel 21 is where we are. Last paragraph there, verse 10. David, if you recall from last week, David is basically on the run. I mean, we don't really classify him on the run till after this chapter, but the reality of it is he's already on the run. He and Jonathan have parted ways. Jonathan has come back with the message that Saul wants to kill David, and so Jonathan has lovingly and tenderly sent David off. So David is on the run. He has met with Ahimelech, the priest. Remember there was I wouldn't say confrontation. That's the word that comes to mind, but that's really a poor choice of words. I'd say the discussion between he and Ahimelech and the use of the showbread, and was he using the showbread or just the special bread, the holy bread, or just common bread? And we talked a little bit about that last week. But one of the things that's important, I think, was right there at the end of our discussion last week, and that is that he basically he obtained, he being David, obtained Goliath's sword. Ahimelech knew where it was, right there in town. He had it, and it had probably been being shown as some sort of spoil, if you will, trophy from the defeat of Goliath. And so David is able to secure that from Ahimelech. And then, beginning in verse 10 of 1 Samuel 21, you have really a paragraph that has some, from a standpoint of chronology, has some ambiguity about it. Exactly where does this fit in? Because it's being mentioned in a couple of other places. And that's one thing when we come to the study of the book of 1 Samuel, I think it's good to see sort of the era, if you will, of Samuel, Saul, and David, but to understand that there are a lot of confusing ties and leads within it with regards to chronology. So don't hold to the chronology of it, hold to the story of it. And I think that's what the Lord is trying to get us to do, is hold to the story that is in 1 Samuel. There's not a lot of application from time to time that can be made, but it is a story that if you stop and think about from the standpoint of God's saving of his people, that helps, I think, a lot. And so in many ways, this is history, a story, but it's important. And we find out things with regards to David. David arose, this is verse 10 now, 1 Samuel 21, and fled that day from before Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. Gath is if you were to go as far south in Israel as you could have gone in his day, and yet in Philistia gone as far north as you could have gone. So in other words, right there, sort of on the line, the border, if you will, between the two, there sat this town and there sat this place that David went to Gath. And he went to find Achish, the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said to him, "Is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not sing of him to one another in dances, saying, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s? There's two things, at least to me, that are interesting in this verse, maybe to you as well. When they notice that it's David, when the servants notice that it's David, they proclaim him as king. Now, he's been anointed, but Saul is still reigning, as the children of Israel would consider it. And so you might say, and I don't know the answer to this, because I asked the same question, how'd they know? How'd they know? Don't know. Had word gotten spread that David was going to take after Saul? Is it possible that this is a little bit later in the chronology than we would think? That's why this poses a bit of a problem from a chronological standpoint. Is it possible that Jonathan had sent word? We don't know. I just find it fascinating that they proclaimed David as king. And not only did they proclaim David as king, but they also knew, which this I can understand how they knew this. But isn't he the one that the women were talking about? Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. Yeah, we saw that. We've already seen that. And so, yeah, that could have been very well known. But you see, they're fixing, if you will, the identity of David. If you were to go about trying to fix my identity, you can get on the internet and you can find out a whole lot of things about me. And each one makes up, if you will, my identity. You can find out, funerals that I've done that were in the papers, and so they're there. You can find out a lot of my lineage over the internet. You can find out where I have lived. You can find out, even though there are none, you can find out the aliases that I have had. You can find out, like I say, past addresses. You can, if you pay a little bit, you can find out past phone numbers that I had. You can find out, because I found out day before yesterday, I was interested in something, and so I went and looked at the house that Suzanne and I purchased when we were living in Mayfield, Kentucky, and we sold it, let me think when we left, 1995, early in 1995, yes. We sold it, and I found out how much they gave us for it. I already knew how much paid for it. Too much. No, really, it was housing in Mayfield is somewhat cheap. And so, but you can find out a lot of things. Well, all of those in many ways make up my identity. They were trying to make up David's identity because there were probably more than one Davids at this time. Everybody just went by the first name. Now, David took these words to heart and was very much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. We don't know, and we don't know because scriptures don't tell us why David was all of a sudden afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. It would seem as if that David had probably come there with the idea of, hey, let me hide here. Let me get away from Saul. Let me hide here. And maybe he was simply put, he was trying to get to a place that he would see somebody maybe from Achish, but he would not see Achish himself. Maybe see a servant. That could be a possibility. It could be the fact that all of a sudden fear came over him. We don't know, but nevertheless, he's afraid. And so he begins to act in such a way so as Achish might think that he's not in his right mind. Look what he does. He changed his behavior before them. He pretended madness or insanity in their hands. He scratched. The word scratched there also has the idea of scribbled. He scribbled on the doors of the gate. And fourthly, he let his saliva fall down on his beard as if to drool. Well, I think any of us looking at that might say, something's a little bit wrong. Something's a little bit amiss. And so David acts this way. And so then in verse 14, Achish said to his servants, look, you see the man is insane. Why have you brought him to me? In other words, hey, you all see what I see. I see a man that's got some issues. So he rebukes them, I think, because here's what he says. Why have you brought him to me? Need of a madman, that you've brought this fellow, play the madman in my. Shall this fellow come into my house. The idea of coming into my house is the idea of dwelling in my city. In other words, do we need somebody else with another problem to come into our city and to live? So you could say ultimately Achish is not a welcoming committee. Do y'all remember Welcome Wagon? Y'all remember that? Yeah, it's where they come and they welcome you in the community and they bring you all sorts of. When I moved to Dixon, of course that was a thing that was dying out, but one of our members knew the lady that had done it for years, and she made an appointment with us, came and brought us all kinds of stuff when we first moved to Dixon back in 2000, and they do. They bring you coupons. It's sort of a way of introducing you to the community, tell you what's what in the community, who's who, and here's some coupons. Go out and eat here, go out and eat there. Of course, it's the idea of getting business and getting customers. Well, Achish was not the welcome wagon. Matter of fact, he wasn't rolling out the red carpet to welcome David, because he saw, or what he thought he saw, was someone that didn't fit the mold of what he wanted. There are several stories to our applications that can be made out of that. First of all, the idea of because they don't look like us doesn't mean that they're not like us. You ever thought about that one? Just because they don't look like us and they don't act exactly like us doesn't mean they're not like us. He's acting like he's crazy, but well, let me apply what I'm trying to say. Let me finish what I'm trying to say. We have people come into the church building, and if they're dressed a little different, they look a little different than us. Maybe they have markings on them, whether it be tattoos or scars that show a rough life. I knew of a guy once that walked into the church building, and he had shabby clothes, had a stench about him, hair had not been cut, and he came in and he walked down the front and he sat down on the floor. Now, what would we do? What would we do? Tell you what they did. One of the elders got up and went, sat down on the floor beside him. We'll let Jay do that, George. We know your knees bother you, so we'll let Jay do that. But you see, just because people look different from us or act different from us doesn't mean that they're different from us. Now, that's where I was going with that, Steve. You may disagree with that. That's fine. Sure. But see, here's what he's saying. Notice what he says. Shall this fellow come into my house? This is an idiom. And the idiom is, shall I allow him to dwell in my city? There's not much difference, I think. I may be wrong. That's my thinking. I also see something else. Think about, we don't really know how welcoming Achish would have been. But for whatever reason, fear fell upon David. We often let fear change everything we thought we would do. Now, how much of this fear changed what David thought he would do? I don't know, because there's not really enough given. But it reminds us, and we'll see this again here in the next chapter too. We'll see fear come upon folks, and fear causes folks to act differently. And so consequently, we need to be sure that we keep our fears in check and know that God is with us and God will take care of us. There are other things. Anything else? Well, could be. Yeah, could be. I think I think he went because he was trying to flee sort of the territory of Saul. Yeah, the 200 men. We're gonna see them in the next chapter. Well, see that this is where when you get into theologians, this is why a lot of them believe that this paragraph, from a chronological standpoint, is out of place. Yeah, and so there are questions like that you just can't answer because of contextually it doesn't flow from thought to thought. It flows more from. It's almost as if to me that as Samuel sat down and wrote this book uh, that he was more interested in the stories than trying to get everything to flow just right. And I may be wrong there, but that just seems to me to be the point. Anything else? Well, yeah, they were. They were. Oh, sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. We're not debating the story. That's a good point, Steve. We're not debating the story. We're just debating the time frame. But we have to remember that, how do I put this? The Bible itself, in the order in which it exists today, is not in chronological order. I mean, that's probably the best way of putting it. Go look at Matthew. Think about Matthew versus Luke. Contrast that sometimes. Trying to figure out the chronology of it. There's a lot of books out there that will help you do that. But when you begin to do that, what you find out is that Matthew grouped things together. Luke is more chronologically correct in the life of Christ. But then if you go and think, okay, well, I want to try to piece together the life of Paul outside of the book of Acts. Now, Acts is where you can fit everything in. But think about Romans would have been written in the first third of his life, or first third of his ministry. Romans, First, Second Corinthians, about the middle of his ministry. Uh, Galatians, Galatians was written towards the first, but Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians were written right towards the end of Acts. First Thessalonians may have been written right at the beginning of his ministry. You see, it's not, of course, admittedly, those books tell more of principles than they do stories. But we're not debating the content. We're just saying chronology is very difficult to find, very hard. If you're interested in that, there's a book called The Chronological Bible, which F. LaGard Smith put together. There are, I think the last I found, there were it's in two different versions. But it's in the NIV. Chronological Bible is in the NIV, and I believe the King James. But anyway, it while I would debate some of his chronology, it's kind of an interesting way of reading the Bible from beginning to end, time wise. Yeah, yeah. George has had it. I'm trying to think. You did it out of the NIV, right, George? But I think they've done it. It's in another two versions now. Yeah. I think it was in NIV, and I think they've now put it in the King James version. But it's an interesting way of studying the Bible, I think. Like I say, I would sometimes, I think, a little out of order. Mhm. Yeah, it's good. Mhm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Right, right, right. It's yeah, George. When I first came here, the Thursday class, we were finishing up a year, I believe. We did it as well. I mean, that was the second time you'd done it, I believe. Yeah, it's very good. Um, there are different ways of studying the Bible, and that's one of them, and that's a good way. There's, of course, a lot of other ways of studying the Bible, but I would encourage you to think about if you're looking for a different way of studying, say 2025. Talk to me. We'll figure out what's best for you, and I'll get you a schedule or a book or whatever. And we'll help you out. But sometimes, if you go at it from a different angle, you pick up a little bit more, and it is a good way of studying that, I think. Anything else about the 21st chapter before we go to the 22nd chapter? Well, let's begin the 22nd chapter. We're going to find David and his 400 men. David, there, yeah. Oh, it was the position of king, if I understand your question correctly. Oh, yeah, in his area, because these were different countries. Yes, yes, yes. Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand, but yes, yes. King could be. I mean, that's where if we had it from a chronological standpoint, we would understand or have better feeling for why they did it. I don't know. I mean, your guess is as good as mine, really. It really is. It's good, and it's a good thought. Good thought. Which helps us. There's another point to make with regards to Bible study, and that is that there are things that are just matters of interpretation, and you may see it one way and I may see it another, that are not matters of salvation. And right, it's all right. You know, like why did they call him? You may have one take and I may have another. And I'm not saying I'm right and you're wrong, and hopefully you're not saying you're right and I'm wrong, but I may be. So, oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. A person, I think, I believe, can go to heaven and really not know much about, say, the Old Testament. But a knowledge of the Old Testament sure does help us understand the New Testament. You might, you might. That's right. That's right. Very true. Had some of that happen. Yeah. I I think about a guy that I studied with and baptized, and he could not read. So the only thing he really picked up is what he picked up in church because he couldn't read. So very true. Well, they had pieces of it. They didn't have a completed form yet. Yeah, the convergence of the text didn't come about till 12th century starting. Began That was the beginning of the convergence of all the text. It's not They really didn't become complete till 1500s, early 1500s when you had, and at that point you were still debating. See, that was the time of Martin Luther and all, and you were still debating over books whether they should have been included or not in the Textus Receptus. Textus Receptus, received text. That's kind of what it had become known as. And like I say, there was, great disputes. James, Book of Revelation, and some had other, some scholars would say because they didn't like the theology in some of them. Oh, no, we exclude those. And so you didn't have a convergence of completed text probably till late 1500s, as we know it, of all 66 books as we know it. And what happened then is a beginning of acceptance of the text, and beginning an acceptance of these are true and we hold these to be from God. Anything else? Council of Nicene? That was the beginning of, let's try to find what we have, put it together. Yes. Yes. Right. Yeah. 1611 is the first King James version. Now you had other versions before that, but that's the first. Well, no, not a bunch of English ones, and right, and the English one, King James became more widespread. I think is what I'm trying to say. To became more the accepted version of the people, even though there were some other individuals that had translated the Bible before that tried to have an accepted text. It just didn't become as widespread. Yeah, yeah, yeah. They weren't as widespread. James. Right. Yeah, you had others that were doing it all along. You had quite a few actually that were doing it all along, even during the time of James. King James, because he had money, he had authority, he had power, and also because he also had the ability, through, of course, the help of Gutenberg and the movable press, printing press, to print the Bible in multitude of numbers. And James had the finances to see that it got shipped around. It was a way of preserving, also, if you stop thinking about it, it's a way of preserving his name and thus his legacy. Interesting. All right. 1 Samuel 22. David therefore departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. When all the house heard it, they went down there to him. And everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was discontented gathered to him. So he became captain over them, and there were about 400 men with him. So David had all these malcontents. You see, today in our politics, it's not anything new. Have malcontents today. Yes, they had malcontents in David's day. These folks didn't like what had gone on with Saul. These folks that as said, of course, he said, brothers, father's house heard it. They went down there with him, and folks that were in distress, in debt, discontented, they gathered together, and David became their captain. And David had a cohort of 400 men. These were fighting soldiers. These are folks, though, that helped David. These are the folks that are with David and taking care of David. And they do put their hand, if you will, to the sword, and they do fight. And we'll see that. But David is assembling, or has assembled, a small army. David, verse 3, went from there to Mizpah of Moab, and he said to the king of Moab, please let my father and mother come here with you till I know what God will do for me. I find this verse interesting. And this is interesting because of this. He pleads with them to allow his parents to stay until really he can figure everything out. Notice what he says. till I know what God will do for me. He has an understanding that God's going to be for him, that God is going to watch over him. Now, this is interesting because a little later on, we're going to see where Saul's going to find out where David is, and he's going to say that God delivered David into his hand, which poses at least a problem in thought that some folks have great difficulty with, and I don't intend on getting into this tonight, but that is the idea of how do we know in our life when things are going the way they're going that this is of God and this is not of God. A lot of folks credit everything that happens to them. That, well, this was God, this was God, this was God. And some folks credit nothing. Well, by chance this happened. Well, this was just, this was pure luck. Notice, though, that David basically says, can mom and dad stay here? As he talks to the king of Moab, can they stay here? And when I figure out what God wants done with me, he says, we'll move forward. So he brought them, because evidently they said yes. So he brought them before the king of Moab. They dwelt with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. So the interesting part is, if you think about it, is that the Moabites, Moab, received children of Israel, or the Judeans, into their land. Why is that important? Who's in the lineage of Jesus that was a Moabite? And so you see, we to get all of this in here. Jesse, who's Jesse? David's father. Jesse is Ruth's son. Very good. Connection as well. You might say, well, why is that important? Because you see, that ties into the story. Ties into the story even of Jesus. That there was a time in which David carried his family back, so to speak, into a land that God would accept and would accept God. Now, the prophet Gad, said to David, do not stay in the stronghold, depart and go to the land of Judah. So David departed and went into the forest of Hereth. When Saul heard that David and the men who were with him had been discovered, now Saul was staying in Gibeah under a tamarisk tree in Ramah, with his spear in his hand and all of his servants standing about him. This is kind of an interesting yet odd scene. Notice that it says that Saul is in Gibeah. He's under a tamarisk tree. If you go look tamarisk trees up, they're interesting. They thrive. Well, actually, they are an invasive species in most places, but in places that are arid, sandy, they tend to do quite well. They are able to sink their roots very deep to find water, and they take over. They don't grow very tall. About 30 feet is about all they grow, but they tend to bush out, and they make good shade, and there's also a little wind with them. So this has been a good place for him to have been. Notice, as it talks about, he has his spear in his hand. Why? Some say getting ready to fight. Some say that it was like holding his scepter in his hand, that he's showing his authority. Don't know, but just the story here says he had his spear in his hand, and all of his servants were standing around him. Then Saul said to his servants who stood about him, "Hear now, you Benjamites." I want you to take note of this, because until studying this today, I hadn't really thought about this. When I came across something in studying today that has intrigued me, and I want to look into a little bit further. The difference, this author made this point. He said the difference between David's kingship and Saul's kingship is that Saul's kingship, basically all of his cabinet, if you will, all of his folks that were with him in authority, that he had placed in authority, were from the tribe of Benjamin. That is true. David's, as we'll see, his folks are from all over. David's was, according to this author, considered a more universal king, whereas Saul was more limited in that he just had those from Benjamin. There's a lot of truth to the one about Saul, and I really haven't studied or stopped to think about, and I think he's correct, but I haven't stopped to think through thoroughly the idea of David's cabinet. But anyway, when he refers to them as Benjamites, he's hit all of them. How now, you Benjamites? Will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards and make you all captains of thousands and captains of hundreds? All of you have conspired against me, and there is not one who reveals to me that my son has made a covenant with the son of Jesse, and there is not one of you who is sorry for me or reveals to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait as it is this day. Saul feels this. He feels as if he's been conspired against. He feels as if, it's interesting because he makes mention of, and maybe he knew, would seem as if he would know, that he knew that David and Jonathan had made a pact. And his own son was against him, he thought. Isn't it interesting, though? Think about this, and think about in the other times that you have studied, whether personally or through a Bible class, 1 Samuel, how that Jonathan, yes, helps David escape, but Jonathan goes back and stands beside Saul, beside his father, and fights with his father. And so it's interesting, though, how Saul is conceiving of all of this. Like I have said before, and I think I know it will come up again, but I think that Saul himself had a mental issue. And we'll talk about that a little bit when we get especially to chapter 28. But he goes on to say, he says, you haven't felt sorry for me. You haven't done anything about it. You've conspired against me. He begins this ego trip that we've talked about here before we started talking about David, that he is on, that all of a sudden, everybody's left me. Then answered Doeg, the Edomite, who was set over the servants of Saul, and said, I saw the son of Jesse going to Nob, to Abimelech, the son of Ahitub. And he inquired of the Lord for him, gave him provisions, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. Well, that's true. So the king sent to call Ahimelech, the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all of his father's house, and the priest who were in Nob, and they all came to the king. And Saul said, Hear now, son of Ahitub. He answered, Here am I, Lord. Or here I am, my Lord. Then Saul said to him, Why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, in that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, that he should rise against me to lie in wait as it is this day? I'm going to stop right there, not because I think it's a great place to stop, but because the bell has rung. And so there's something in here I want to talk about, and it's going to take more than just a couple of minutes. And so, because I don't want the women to feel like they stay back there. One night I went back there and got them because they didn't come out, and I think they felt like they had been trapped. So we don't want that to happen. But is there anything else? Well, let's bow for a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we're thankful for this day, thankful for the blessing of it, thankful for the opportunity to study your word, thankful for what it means to us, that it's a lamp to our feet and light to our path. As we see the story that we have tonight, and we see your hand in all of this, and we see the care that you have provided in order to fulfill your your mission and your message so that salvation of mankind might come true. We're thankful for that salvation. We're thankful for the Son that you provided that died upon the cross for us. We're thankful for Jesus' love for us, that he would also give his life so that we might have the forgiveness of sins that we have and the hope of heaven that lies before us. We ask that you watch over us now, bless us and keep us, be with those that were mentioned that were not doing well. We ask that you bless them and tend to their needs as they are and as they have them. We ask that you watch over us, bless us, and keep us. Forgive us of our sins and hold us as we hold to you. For this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Just like on Sunday mornings, we're beginning to get to closer to the end of this book. If you have an idea of what you want to study, I have an idea of where I'm going if no one suggests anything. But if you have a suggestion, I'll be glad to see what I can do to entertain that. And we're also getting close, very close to the end on Sunday morning. But anyway, y'all have a great night. Thank y'all.